Now I want to turn to the question, the crucial question of how many people were sold into the trade. The most reliable estimate of the number of African men, women, and children sold into slavery in the Americas is 12.5 million, about 10.5 million of whom survived the journey. If you look at this table, you can see that trade and the volume of the trade over time and the distribution of slaves in the Americas. And I think you'll quickly notice a number of things. If you look at the top of the table, you will see that the Atlantic share of the total slave trade grew over time. And you can see that the volume of trade grew through the beginning of the 19th century and then declined quite strikingly. So let me ask you why you think that was. At the bottom of the table, you can see the distribution in the Americas, and here too the pattern is pretty clear. Brazil was always the largest shipper of slaves and destination of slaves, more than 40% of the total, and the British Caribbean was next with almost 30% of the total. So taken together, what that means is that 7 out of every 10 slaves who crossed the Atlantic ended up in one of those two places. You will also notice something else of significance and great importance to us, and that is that British North America, or the mainland North American colonies, were never very much of anything. 361,000 people total, smaller actually than we previously thought. Less than 4% of the total slaves sold in the transatlantic trade ended up in North America. This same information obviously tells you a lot about where enslaved people ended up in the Americas. And if you look at this map, this is another way of envisioning the same data. And again, you can see the dominance of Brazil and the insignificance of mainland North America. And this is just another way of seeing the slave trade flow all together in one map over the whole period of time. So we can work on this data together, and you can go into the Voyages database and do what you want with it yourself, pursue the things that are of most interest to you. But the pattern that emerges, at least the most dominant pattern, is very striking. What this data tells us is one thing for sure: the importance of sugar in the shape of the transatlantic slave trade and the fate of the people who were caught up in it. Slaves crossed the Atlantic for forced labor, primarily in the production of sugar. Gold and silver were important in the early period, cotton and coffee in the 19th century. But from the late 16th century down to 1820, 90% of the slaves who were brought across the Atlantic were brought there because of sugar. What became the American South was part of this Atlantic world created by the African slave trade, part of this same global history of slavery, empire, and trade in plantation products. But as is already obvious, there were some very particular parts to that history in terms of the political economy and culture of the people who lived through it.